Hello and welcome everybody to episode 71 of Comic DNA. And this is an extra special episode because although this is X edition number 12, we will be talking about X-Men issues number 12 and 13 because it's basically a two-part story, and frankly, Alex and I don't feel like wasting our time doing two episodes on something that we could easily talk about in one episode.
But does that mean we call this X edition number 12 and 13?
No. I don't want to... Alex, you know that I have a particular OCD about structure and...
I think we both do.
How you organize things, and we're just not, okay? We can't. Like, this is X edition number 12... And I realize that means on the next episode, X edition number 13 is going to be X-Men issue 14.
And that's going to be Comic DNA number 72.
It's going to be way too many numbers. The whole thing is just awful. And we're like Marvel Comics now, where we've just like year after year, we've just dug ourselves into a hole of renumbering and restarting and then going back to old numbers and then restarting and then sort of
it's just entropy, man.
Yeah, doing creative math to try to get to some sort of milestone number where like they include issues that weren't necessarily a part of the series, but they're part of the character life. So whatever, it's issue 600, like
brutal.
I got to be perfectly honest. I don't know what the answer is for this podcast. The next episode, I might just drop the whole X edition thing because I was mostly just doing it as a joke anyway. I didn't really think it was going to be like a real thing.
I think what you set up was great. We just have to commit to it through the remainder of these X-Men issues, and if it's incredibly confusing, so be it. Let it be a cautionary tale to all of our listeners.
Okay, right now that's what I'm going with. So
okay.
We're doing, this is X edition number 12, on which we talk about X-Men issues number 12 and 13. Who knows what the future will hold? I'm going to probably start the next podcast episode out by spouting out like 6 different numbers. And it's up to you to figure out what that means. It's not my concern anymore. I'm not here to talk about bureaucratic red tape mumbo jumbo about numbers and nonsense. We're here to talk about the X-Men comics.
We're here to talk about the X-Men.
That's right. So, I got to tell you a little story, Alex. Now, I know we don't intend on going all night talking about 2 issues. The idea was that we would do 2 issues because it'll be more efficient.
Yes.
But let me tell you, after that last episode we did, bad comics make for a bad podcast. Because
I don't know who wouldn't want to listen to us talk about bad comics over and over again for an hour.
I gotta be perfectly honest. When I was editing that episode, I was so miserable. I hated. I actually toyed with the idea of just deleting it all and just being like, screw it, we'll just re-record X edition number 11 with X-Men issues 12 and 13 and just like really throw it off.
Whoa.
Maniac. Like, why even talk about that issue, because we just disliked it so much. But you know what, I am a professional, and we spent an hour and a half of our lives talking about that stupid comic book, and the world needs to know. Well, they don't need to know, but they get to know.
They get to know, and now it's out there forever.
Yeah, it's forever. I edited out, I think, some of the worst aspects of it, but I'm not proud of that episode. It was just...
What's done is done. We can only look forward.
Know what? Yeah, and I only bring it up to proudly proclaim that it's in the past, and we're moving on, and I, frankly, am very excited to talk about these next 2 issues because, well, I don't know about you, but I enjoyed them one heck of a lot more than the previous issue. Granted, that's a very low bar, but
yes, they are substantially better. I think we can say that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of promise with the cover. So I believe it's my turn to do the plot synopsis.
The plot breakdown.
Yeah, the plot breakdown. And I'm just going to go ahead and do it for both issues, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you should do that.
Yeah, because it's actually pretty straightforward.
They work together very cleanly.
Very clean. Yeah, exactly. In fact, this was an interesting thing. Like at this time in Marvel Comics, Stan Lee started stretching out stories into multiple issue arcs. And we sort of seen that play around with a little bit in the X-Men, which is, obviously the series that we've been reading. And I believe it's the only Marvel's 60 series that you've read, right, Alex? The X-Men?
Pretty much,
yeah. Maybe
like bits and pieces, but
exactly.
I'm not a dedicated old Marvel Comics reader.
Right. So, we saw, the 2 issues story with Magneto several issues back, 4, 5, and 6, something like that. 4 and 5. And then some of these previous issues they've been dabbling into leading into the next issue, as we saw with the previous issue where it ended on this sort of a cliffhanger where just as they resolved the whole situation, then Cerebro started going crazy about the most powerful mutant ever coming to attack the mansion. And that's exactly where we jump in with this next issue 12. And before we quite get into that, I gotta say, let's just compare the covers. We're gonna keep going back to issue 11 because it was so bad. This issue 12 cover is kind of great.
It's a pretty cool cover.
Such a powerful Jack Kirby cover. So I'll stop teasing it. This issue is the first appearance of the legendary X-Men villain, the Juggernaut. And it is displayed prominently on the cover, the text featuring the almost indescribable menace of the Juggernaut. And it's the Juggernaut blasting into the room that the X-Men are in, and they're all kind of in disarray, falling back from his power. It's certainly a more exciting cover than the previous issue. I don't know how many times I can say that. I don't know. Does it need to be said anymore?
Probably not. It's a little more dynamic, eye-catching. It makes sense. I'm not confused by things. There's not a giant gray mass. There's a lot of red, but red's exciting.
Yeah.
So.
And it's also there's a lot of red, but it's not big patches of red. There's the copy, the text, the text is over it. You know what I mean? There's not.
Yes.
So it says featuring the indescribable menace of the Juggernaut, but also it boasts the origin of Professor X. So this automatically feels like an important issue. Very, more important than some of the previous issues, that's for sure. So let's just jump into the plot synopsis. We pick up exactly where the previous issue left off, with Cerebro going crazy. And all of the X-Men are just shocked by it. And I'm going to go ahead and just mention this here before I forget about it. One thing that I thought was very interesting about this opening splash page with Cerebro going crazy and Professor X can't, figure out, he can't turn it off yet. And the other X-Men, other than Cyclops, don't know what's going on. And
yeah, that kind of threw me off.
That threw me off. And then Cyclops has that dialogue bubble where he tells them all to get out because nobody's supposed to know about Professor's Cerebro machine. And I was reminded of that previous issue where they graduated and Professor X went to leave. This was before he went to go, before the Lucifer issue. But, And he left Cyclops in charge of the mansion and he took him down to show him his special Cerebro machine, so that Cyclops could use it. And it occurred to me, I don't know why it never really came up, but it occurred to me that, it was a secret, and none of the other X-Men knew about it.
Yeah.
Which is sort of all the more strange, because the previous issue had that weird opening setup where he had, the radar device that could detect mutants, and
it would give them a visual of the mutant.
Yeah, and they were just perfectly fine telling the other X-Men about that. Like, they were all in the room, and he was like, "That's my radar device." But it was really strange that it wasn't Cerebro. And then
apparently Cerebro's extra secret.
Exactly.
They weren't ready for it.
Well, it almost makes you think that, I don't know. It's like that story really had almost nothing to do with the X-Men. You know what I mean? Like, it just was something really rushed out, not really thought out, not a lot of continuity there. Even though it had the, as we discussed, the shuffling off of Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. But dang it, Alex, we're not here to talk about that previous issue. We're here to talk about the Juggernaut. So
I'm gonna start cutting you off if you keep veering back to it.
You got it. You got to. Please.
All right.
Demand. Okay. So I only mention that to say that I had completely forgotten that Cerebro was supposed to be a secret from the other X-Men, and now they all know. Anyway, so basically, I can actually sum this issue up really simply. The professor is really shocked that the most dangerous villain they've ever faced is coming to attack them. So he sends the X-Men to build up some defenses around the mansion to try and stall this oncoming force. And while they're doing that, Professor X tells them the story of his past, his origins, essentially. And he tells them about his time as a child, about how his parents were, or at least his dad anyway, was a scientist, and specifically in Alamogordo, New Mexico, where an atomic bomb went off, or atomic blast. And his dad died in that explosion, and his dad's research partner adopted him and married his widowed mom. And this guy, who was by the name of Dr. Marco, was kind of a sleazebag, and Professor X, before he realized he had mutant powers, could discern this guy's intentions. And he was able to tell that this guy was kind of a jerk, and he was just using his mom for her money, because Professor X comes from money. They were a wealthy family. And eventually he meets his new stepbrother, which is Dr. Marco's son, Kane Marco. And Kane Marco is just a big jerk. He gets expelled from school. He's always picking on wimpy Charles Xavier. And this is all interspersed in between this unstoppable force that's breaking through all of the defenses that they set up. And we see some scenes where he keeps coming into conflict with his new stepbrother, Kane, and there's an insinuation that Kane insinuates that Dr. Marco actually killed Charles Xavier's father, purposely left him to die. And then there's an accident due to Kane's carelessness, which leads to Dr. Marco dying in an actual selfless act where he saves the two boys. Dr. Marco saves Charles and Kane. And they basically grow up. They have a lot of animosity. Charles does really well in school because of his blooming mutant powers. He's able to do really well in his studies because he can read his teacher's thoughts. But he's also a really good athlete because the telepathic powers he has gives him an edge over opponents. Makes perfect sense to me.
Sure.
And Kane is really jealous of him, and because Kane is supposed to be the tough guy, I guess. And finally, they get into a fight, and Professor X, as a teenager, I think he's supposed to be. Maybe he's in college at this point, but he is forced to physically subdue Kane, and he actually physically overpowers him. And then we flash forward to another important moment in their history where Kane was driving Charles Xavier to college, and Charles accepted the invitation of Kane to drive him to college in an attempt to try and be friends with him. And then they get into a car accident, and that's a scene that we will talk about later. And meanwhile, the Juggernaut. I mean, Did I miss something? Does he actually call him the Juggernaut at this point? I forget.
I don't think he's not yet.
Not yet.
So
yeah.
he's giving all these flashbacks, and he gets to where Kane actually ceased to be his stepbrother and became someone with powers.
Now, he does say that it's his brother from the very beginning. He does say that it's his brother that's coming.
Yes.
Which does lend an air of gravitas to it.
Yes.
And then they're like, why? What's the deal with your brother? And he's like, okay, I'll tell you the story.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't understand that he's a jerk, but he's not a mutant. So he's always picking on him, but how is this guy who was previously a jerk able to completely just blast through all of our defenses? And basically the issue, let's see, we keep going through, Professor X's brother keeps blasting through all the defenses. Oh, yes, and then we get to the important flashback scene where Charles tells of the time that they were both in Korea, and Kane deserts the war and tries to hide out in a cave, and that's where he finds the sacred lost temple of Sitarak.
Who saw that coming?
Yeah, not me, that's for sure. Legends have warned of it for centuries, Professor X says. And Kane grabs the ruby and reads the magic passage that's on it, and that turns him into the Juggernaut. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but the process of doing so, turns him into the Juggernaut, and then the Koreans also are bombing the area, which causes a huge cave-in. So Professor X escapes, and then Kane, now turned into the Juggernaut, is trapped under a mountain of rock. And there's that moment where Professor X is running away, and he's thinking to himself, even if the cave-in doesn't kill him, it will take years before he can dig out from beneath that gigantic mountain which covers him. But he's still worried, but even if he should break free, I can think of no power on earth capable of stopping him. So, this whole issue, there's this sense of dread and hopelessness to it. Professor X is... I don't want to get too much into discussing it too much, but Professor X is telling the story almost like there's nothing we can do, but keep building up these defenses. So he keeps sending the X-Men to do more defenses, and Juggernaut keeps breaking through them. And then the issue ends with Juggernaut breaking into the mansion and confronting Charles Xavier and telling him that it's the end of the line. Now I'm going to get you. And that's the end of the issue, and it leads directly into the next issue. Issue 13, Where Walks the Juggernaut? Another good cover, I think. Similar to the previous cover, but a little bit more... the characters are a little bit more confident. They're not in disarray. They're actually attacking the Juggernaut. And you'll notice the Human Torch is on the cover. Little guest star from the Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
So this
issue doesn't call it out with words, but
but it's there.
There's some interesting things happening there.
Yeah. So this
I like the side view of the Juggernaut as well. Sorry.
The Juggernaut, the way he's depicted.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I like the way Kirby draws the Juggernaut a lot, actually. He looks good, and he looks good on this cover. He's emanating power, he's got that field around him. Yeah, it looks
like trouble.
Yeah, exactly.
Looks like trouble.
Classic bad guy.
Anyway, I interrupted.
So it's okay. So this issue picks up directly where it left off. We now know the origin, the setup of Juggernaut and Professor X, and Juggernaut is here to basically kick ass and chew bubblegum, and he's all out of gum. And Professor X tries to stop him with his mental powers, but Juggernaut's special helmet that comes with the costume that was granted him by the gem of Sitarak, the crystal bands, protects him from mental attacks. And this whole issue is just one big action issue of the X-Men trying to stall him while Professor X tries to use a special machine that he has to like charge his mental powers to the fullest of their ability.
He's got a few of these machines.
He's got a few lying around. I mean, we've seen him in previous issues, like this, as famously in the Blob issue, where he had to hastily get it built in time to mind wipe everybody, and then also in they did the same plot device in another issue. I don't remember which one it was.
I'm blanking, but it has come up before.
It has come up before, and then also Beast had to build a special machine to stop Unus in that one issue. So there's this recurring theme of like scientists making machines to amplify powers or stop powers, as it were. And in this case, here it is. He's got this special machine with the purpose of this device is to intensify my brain waves and make them even more powerful than they normally are. So the idea is Professor X is like, go stall the Juggernaut. I'm going to try and beef up my powers so I can get past his helmet. But that might not work, so I'm going to send out an SOS signal to everybody in the city, and hopefully somebody will respond and come help us. And so there's like a lot of these panels of people like getting the mental call, like the Teen Brigade, which I guess that's a thing from the 60s, teenagers. Junior news reporters. There's the little cameo by Daredevil, who's in the middle of court, doing the lawyer thing. And eventually, Professor X makes contact with Johnny Storm, the Human Torch of the Fantastic Four. But it is kind of funny the way like the tension keeps going throughout the issue, because Professor X makes contact with him, but Johnny Storm doubts the veracity of it, and he first thinks that it might be a supervillain trying to trick him into
trying to sabotage Reed's wedding.
Right, which
I think was the issue.
Just a little continuity bit. Fantastic Four Annual Number 4 on sale now, which has the wedding of Reed and Sue. And Johnny Storm is concerned that maybe this is a trick. Could be Dr. Doom planting this thought in his brain. Or the Wizard, trying to get at him to ruin the wedding. So he ignores it. And then Professor X is stressed out because he made contact, but he couldn't convince him. So he just keeps trying it. Meanwhile, the X-Men keep fighting the Juggernaut. And long story short, eventually Professor X convinces Human Torch to show up. He makes contact again, and this time, the Human Torch trusts his instincts, and Professor X gets his help. And through Professor X's direction, the X-Men are able to work as a team to both distract Juggernaut and eventually get his helmet off so that Professor X can use his mental powers to completely subdue him. And then that's the end of it. And then Professor X wipes Human Torch's memory so that he doesn't remember that it happened.
I don't understand why that's so important. Keeps doing that.
It's just like every time Professor X has to do something, memory wipe, like maybe we'll talk about that more later. And then the issue ends with a joke of the X-Men all laid up, wounded from their battle, except for Jean, of course, who does
have a good silly joke ending.
Yeah, she's playing nurse to all of them. And Professor X tells them that when they're all healed up, he's got a special reward for them. And they're all excited about, their special reward. And Professor X laughs and says, "It's a broom for each of you. The school is in shambles after your fight, and somebody has to tidy it up."
Waka, waka, waka.
Oh. So
classic.
Yeah, just a good. I mean, okay, so at least it's back to that smiling Professor X final panel ending. You got to give it that. We've talked about that before. Back. Yeah. Okay, so now that we've got all that out of the way, Alex,
yes, sir.
Historically speaking, we were talking about this in the previous episode. Issue 1 was fantastic, and then since then there have been a few mediocre issues that were approaching greatness, but mostly settled around goodness, and then a lot of stinkers. First impressions, gut reaction. How did you feel about these two issues? reading them back to back.
I think as compared to everything else we've read, I think the sense of excitement and urgency in these issues was probably better than any of the other issues. I think there were some little kind of goofy bits that kept coming up, where I was just kind of like, that plot point was kind of silly, or why are they explaining it this way? But in terms of like big picture, I would say this was maybe not the best, but definitely above average compared to the other issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would have to agree. I actually would say that these are these two issues probably not better than the first issue, which we've discussed. We both think the first issue is incredible, but I think that these are the only two issues so far that have really approached it. The first issue, in terms of just general entertainment and also competence.
Sure.
I have a few issues with the general competence of them. But the balance, like, the competence is maybe not as strong as I would like, and this leads into that discussion of, like, are we being too harsh on it or not? We always end up saying the same thing, no we're not, but, we at least ask the question.
Impossible.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
sure.
in terms of general entertainment, I think that these issues knock it out of the park. I mean, it's first of all, it's a compelling villain with the personal connection. I mean, Juggernaut is a great villain. There's a reason why we've talked about this before. There's a reason that we all know who Juggernaut is, and we don't all know who Unus the Untouchable is. Juggernaut is a great villain who fits an important archetype, and he's designed specifically to do so. The whole like brother versus brother story of Professor X and Kane Marco. And I mean, there's no greater tell than the name. I mean, he's named Kane.
Right.
That classic story, Cain and Abel. You don't even need to be
an oldie.
Yeah, you don't even need to be a Bible scholar to get that one. But because well, I mean that seriously, because it has become such an archetype that it's a thing that gets referenced all the time. It's not even like it's entirely original to name a character Cain, who is the aggressive, jealous brother. But furthermore, it's not just Cain. His name is Kane Marco. The mark of Cain is a very standard phrase. It's a very standard thing. So it's very obviously very deliberate. Which I think, I don't know, maybe I'm just a sucker for something that has any sort of personal investment, just like...
Sure. I think it's the first, unless I'm forgetting a character, remind me, it's the first villain that we've seen introduced in these early issues that where Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and the other artists involved in these issues, which we'll talk about.
We will, yes.
They try and set up some significant backstory for, such as there's emotional stakes, and there's a prior connection, and there's something on the line. It's not just Magneto's a bad guy, he's doing bad things, so we better stop him. It's
right.
Like, this goes back a long way. Some bad blood here.
Yeah, even Magneto, who is the most used villain, barely gets any actual kind of motivation or story. He's just a jerk. He's just a jerk. Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch have more meaning behind their story than Magneto at this point.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, without jumping ahead too far. It's not until Magneto was fleshed out later by other writers that he, I think, became sort of like the greatest X-Men villain. Right now, he's kind of just a cliche.
He's a cliche, right. I mean, just going from these two issues, I would say Juggernaut is the greatest villain to appear in the X-Men.
Yeah, so far. I think I agree.
And I mean, I really do just like the Juggernaut as a villain. I like everything about him.
Mm-hmm.
I like that he's not. I mean, I like that he's a bad guy and that he's like a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that he has Machiavellian like plans, like Machiavellian instincts for evil. Like he's just a jerk. Like he's a bad person.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, he's very simple.
He's a selfish, greedy jerk.
Right, who stumbles upon a great deal of power,
mm-hmm.
and
he uses it.
There's an elegance to it.
Yeah, and he uses it. He uses that power to enact revenge. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I like that. That's good character motivation for a bad guy. At least it's certainly more believable than somebody who like we'll just keep comparing him to Magneto, who's just sort of in this weird like Magneto is powerful, so he's going to rule the world because he thinks mutants are superior. I'll give him credit. That's some kind of motivation. It is.
Even the mutants' is superior bit though is like pretty thin so far.
It's downplayed. Exactly. Yeah. Like it's not played up enough. I agree. That's my problem with it.
Yeah. He's just the mustache twirling villain.
Yeah, like he's just a jerk. I'm just gonna keep saying it.
Yeah. Where Juggernaut's a jerk too, but he's not like cackling about conquering the world.
Right.
He's a like you said, a selfish guy, egotistical, who wanted more when he was younger. Feels like he's got the power now, so he's gonna get back at his brother. He's not rambling about how powerful mutants need to join him,
mm-hmm.
and without any real explanation for why any of his actions matter.
Right. So yeah, I agree. I think he's certainly the best villain. He's got like a real setup, and of course, I mean, he has the benefit of being a character that's tied to Professor X's origin. So, like that's like almost like guaranteed. Like you can't have a villain that's tied to Professor X's origin and not have him some kind of character. Like, you know what I mean? Like because at this point, this is again, like you talked about, like Magneto's not even been fleshed out. Like we haven't gotten any story about how they used to be friends and they worked together and all this stuff. It's just Professor X is the good guy, Magneto's the bad guy. That's it. Juggernaut is the first one where there's some connection to the main characters. You know, again, it's personal. It's not just this grand story of good guys versus bad guys, and there's bad mutants out there, and so the good mutants have to stop them. It's purely personal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's way more compelling than anything else we've seen before. I
agree.
All stories are personal. I just, you know what I mean? Like I'm kind of that opinion. You know, like all people have personal reasons for why they do things, and so that's what makes this really great.
I agree.
So yeah, enough fanboying about Juggernaut. I mean, I would actually say, like, if you want to take a moment before we get into these issues, I seriously mean that. Juggernaut is one of my favorite X-Men villains. Possibly my actual favorite. I mean, Magneto is great for, you know, what he actually became, but I think Juggernaut might actually be my number one favorite villain, just in terms of like what his powers are. I like that the villain is like the definition of his powers is that he's unstoppable. I love that as for the role of the villain, because how do you that really casts the heroes in truly challenging situation. Like, how do you stop something that is actually unstoppable? And
it always makes for a really fun action comic.
Yes.
Because he's a freight train coming through, and he's also a puzzle. And so I feel like every good Juggernaut story has this. There's a lot of things getting wrecked. There's, you know, it's
and we see that in this
high
issue.
Octane comics.
Yeah, there's so much action in these issues. Would you say that these two issues are the most action packed out of all the issues of the X-Men we've seen so far?
I think so.
I want to say
continual.
so. It's because across these 2 issues, yeah, it never stops.
Right.
It doesn't stop. Even the first issue, which is mostly alternating back and forth between Professor X telling his origin and the Juggernaut breaking onto the compound, there is a sense of momentum. Like, it just keeps building and building and building until the next issue, which is just straight action for the whole issue. Like, it's just a big fight. And And you're exactly right in how you describe that. Like, Juggernaut stories are always like that. Like you said, he's a freight train coming through. Like, you can fight with him, but you can't just stop him with physical force. There's always a puzzle in how you stop him. And that's what makes him, in my mind, such a compelling villain. Now, that also has the downside of every time you use him, you have to kind of come up with something different for how you defeat him. Otherwise, it just gets to be the same thing over and over again.
Right.
But from the sense of, like, the story, like just what the story is, like how the character is used, I think he's the perfect villain for that reason. Like, he doesn't have I mean, I don't know. He has a weakness per se, which we will talk about, but he's not like he's not like other villains in that, like, you can just defeat him by overpowering him in some way. I mean, we even saw that with Magneto when Magneto tried to get Namor to join him, and Namor just flexed really hard, and destroyed all of Magneto's machinery.
I mean, that's across every Magneto story thus far, when it's like 4 issues or something.
Yeah,
he does something cool, they dodge it or stop it, and then he runs away.
Yes,
and it's so lame. It's so disappointing.
It's so lame, exactly. Like,
and this is the opposite of that. It's like they do something to slow him down, but then he keeps coming. And they do something, like, it's just like page after page of, like, these stalling things where the characters are also getting, like, knocked about, which I
really
love.
are. Yeah.
Like, it's just fun comics. It's good superhero comics.
It really is. Yeah. Exactly. Like, yeah, they keep stalling him. All they can do is stall him. He just keeps coming. They can't stop him until, in the end, when they finally figure out a way to stop him. And then, and I want to point this out, they actually do stop him. Like, it comes to an ending where, like, they're triumphantly, like, Professor X, like puts an end to it. He doesn't run away like Magneto does. Or there isn't even a vague, like, we're gonna let you leave so that you know we're here to stop you if you ever try this again, like they did with that stupid character Lucifer. You know, like, and I will say that maybe they Jack Kirby tastefully didn't definitively say what happened to the Juggernaut. Like, we don't see him literally getting taken away by the cops, but it is handled in such a way where it's an ending where Professor X actually stops him, and then just because they don't, like, I think it's done really well where they don't it's sort of exactly what we were complaining about with the Lucifer issue, where there's that panel where they're like, we've defeated you, and there's a lot of different ways you could have taken those panels, like when you talk about how Jack Kirby drew it versus how it was written, and you know, Stan Lee specifically wrote the story so that Professor X said we were letting you escape. You know what I mean? Like, he specifically said, we're letting you go.
It makes me chuckle because it's almost like, given the Marvel method, it's almost like this happened a few times, so Jack Kirby did give Stan Lee the option this time.
Exactly, yeah. It is almost like that. So right. That's what. So I appreciate that this comes to, like, a definitive ending where they actually stop him. And we don't need to see the specific scenes where, you know, like, Avengers are taking him away, or, you know, the cops are hauling him away. But there's no scene where Professor X is letting him leave. That's just, like, that's the low bar that we're at with these comics so far, you know. But so let's talk a little bit about that, the Marvel method, because I think that weighs heavily into what's going on with these issues. All the issues that we've read so far, but specifically this issue. So one thing that's important to note, issue 12 is the first issue of the series that Jack Kirby is not actually the penciler on. He doesn't do the full pencils. this is the point where they bring in other freelancers. And this was a thing that was happening at Marvel at the time, because I don't want to do too much Marvel history because, first of all, I'm not actually an expert on it. I read things here and there. But basically what was happening was Stan Lee was really trying to rebuild Marvel from the ground up at this point. Like, the company was almost dead. And he couldn't afford to hire artists for all these new books. So he basically had just Steve Ditko doing Spider-Man and Jack Kirby doing everything else. Just like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were the only two artists he could afford. And I'm not saying that definitively. There might have been some other artists working at the time. I don't know. But for all intents and purposes, Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby created the Marvel Universe. Steve Ditko was doing Spider-Man, of course, and he was doing Doctor Strange, and then he's the one who, I think, also did Iron Man and Hulk. Like, he brought them kind of... If he didn't necessarily specifically create them, he's kind of responsible for bringing them back. And Jack Kirby was doing the Avengers and the X-Men and Thor, and so what would happen was Stan Lee would work with Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko for a little while on a book after about a year, and then they would bring in another freelancer because the Marvel line was doing really well at this time. They started selling in massive numbers, mostly due to Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. And so he would move Jack Kirby onto another book, and then they would bring in a freelancer to, take over for the series that Jack had created. And then this is where we run into the famous Marvel method of comic creation, which was Stan Lee would provide... We've talked about this on the podcast before, but if you didn't listen to any other episodes, Stan Lee would provide an outline or a description of what would happen in the issue, and then Jack Kirby would write it and draw it, and then send the pages to Stan Lee. And all the time, Jack Kirby would write in the margins outside the panels what was happening, and also suggested dialogue for basically, so that Stan Lee had a clear idea of what was happening in the story. And then Stan Lee would write the dialogue out the way he wanted it, and then you would have your final comic. Now, what this really amounts to, in my opinion, I mean, there's a certain creative aspect that can be fun with that. This sort of like back and forth mishmash, But
sure.
Really, what it comes down to is Stan Lee was trying to cut corners as much as possible. He didn't have time to write out full scripts, nor did he want to. And Jack Kirby was truly a great enough comic book creator that he did not need a full script to tell a story. He could write it himself. He wasn't just an artist, he was also a writer. He was competent. And so Stan Lee knew that he could rely on Jack Kirby to do that. And so when it came time that Marvel Comics was doing better and well enough that they could start hiring other freelance artists, then they ran into an issue where Stan Lee wanted to keep doing the Marvel style with these new artists, but these new artists weren't necessarily used to working like that. They were artists. They weren't being paid to be writers. Because I think this is the other thing that's important to note, is that Jack Kirby was doing this without being paid to be the writer. Most other people would say, like, yeah, I'll write the story, but you got to pay me for the writer too. I'm the writer and artist. And Jack Kirby was just being paid the artist rates, while Stan Lee was being paid the writer rates, even though Jack Kirby was doing most of the writing. And so a lot of artists, I think, either had trouble or balked at doing the Marvel method. They weren't necessarily into it because it's more work for them. I can tell you personally, as somebody who has self-published comics and worked with a handful of artists, I've worked with artists who were happy to work like this, just for funsies. We tried it out. That's what the artist Kevin Bant and I were doing on my book Amoral Stingray. And then I've worked with other artists who didn't want to do it. They don't want to take the time to try and write out how the page is supposed to look. They say, just give me a full script and I'll draw it. So, different people work different ways. That all brings us to this issue, which is penciled by the legendary Alex Toth. Alex, are you that familiar with Alex Toth?
Not really. Like, is it Hanna-Barbera stuff?
Yes.
Was that what he was tied to?
He created Space Ghost.
Okay,
And,
gotcha.
Birdman, the Herculoids.
Okay.
He did all that stuff for Hanna-Barbera.
Okay. I guess I knew that broadly, but I don't know his work particularly well.
Well, he did do a lot of comics work before that. Like, he actually has done a lot of comics for DC. And this was I guess not the only comic that he did for Marvel, but certainly the only comic that anybody would remember. Like he had done probably some random comics for Marvel, like in the 50s when they were just doing like Western and romance comics before superheroes. Like just one-off comics here and there. And possibly even before Stan Lee had recreated Marvel with the Mighty Marvel style. So anyway, the point is, Alex Toth is kind of an industry legend, I would say. I mean, he's a great artist. He's got a lot of recognition to his name, and this is I think it's kind of a big deal that he drew an issue of the X-Men.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah. But it's
funny. I don't actually like it as much as
that's
Kirby's work.
That's where I was going to go with that. Yeah. So it's important to note that Jack Kirby still did the layouts for the issue,
right?
And the sort of accepted reasoning for that would be is because a lot of artists really didn't know how to handle the Marvel method of writing the issue. Like, they wanted a full script, describe how many panels on the page, what happens in each panel, whatever. Stan Lee didn't write like that. So he paid Jack Kirby to write them for him, essentially. Jack Kirby being paid to do layouts for an issue was secretly Jack Kirby being paid to write the issue for Stan Lee.
Okay.
That's my that's how I read it. And
it's interesting.
I don't think that's wrong.
Okay.
That's not to say
Stan Lee's initial pitches for issues were sometimes very sparse, right?
Yeah, like they could be as small as literally a paragraph of like 6 sentences.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Worth noting.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting, exactly. Now, that's not to say that I still think Stan Lee brings something to the table when he adds all the dialogue afterwards. I think that's important. I don't want to downplay that too much. But, that being said, I think that from here on out in the X-Men, certainly, we will see issues that have layouts by Jack Kirby, and the pencils are actually by a different freelance artist. And I think the reason for that is Stan could trust Jack to write the issue, and it would be competent and sellable, and then another artist would draw it, and then Stan would go in and add the dialogue. Because Stan could trust Jack Kirby. He liked Jack Kirby's work. He knew that Jack Kirby was good. So that's where we're at with this issue. So Alex Toth is the one who illustrates it, but it's based off of Jack Kirby's layouts. So Alex, you said,
right, for issue 12.
For issue 12 only. That's right. Alex Toth didn't stick around, and the sort of, I think the understanding is he probably didn't work well with the Marvel method. He wasn't interested in drawing Kirby's layouts, and he probably didn't like Stan Lee that much. There were a lot of artists that didn't like Stan Lee. Another industry legend, Wally Wood, famously just like hated Stan Lee and wouldn't work with him. But that's a different story. But yeah, so Alex Toth never went back to Marvel. This was the only issue he drew, and I think the idea is probably it was kind of a tryout issue. Like, they gave this issue to Alex, draw it based off of Kirby's layouts. We'll see how you do, and if we'll keep it going. And he probably didn't want to keep it going. He probably wasn't comfortable with it, and he found work elsewhere that he liked doing. Because I think this would have been even before he did all the Hanna-Barbera stuff.
Okay.
Just to put it in like a timeline. So he probably did this and didn't like it, so he went on to do some other TV stuff and eventually got hired at Hanna-Barbera to create characters for them. And Alex Toth is also responsible for producing the famous Super Friends cartoon. The DC, Superman, Batman from in the 70s.
Okay.
So
these issues are right around, they're like 65.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Right around that time. I think Space Ghost was like 66. So it was sort of all been happening at around the same time. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But anyway, so Alex, as an artist, you're a professional artist. Like
of the sort.
As in you do it for a living. You didn't like Alex Toth compared to Jack Kirby, huh?
I mean, he's still a talented artist, but I like Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby's got
he's just got that certain indescribable something, doesn't he?
It's how do you say I don't know?
Yeah.
No, I think especially as he got further into his career, Kirby's stuff is just very iconic.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see somebody kind of drawing over Kirby's stuff without being Kirby, you kind of get, you can feel like when you're getting Beast in a panel, for instance, it looks like a Kirby pose, but it doesn't have the same kind of chunky inks and kind of just strength of the shapes don't pop in quite the same way.
I know what you mean. It's like store brand versus like the tried and true. Well, and the weird thing is like it's interesting to note that because Alex Toth is a good artist.
Yes.
In fact, I think you could make the case that he's actually a better artist than Jack Kirby. Like in more technical skill.
Sure, technically correct, but maybe not as, again, like iconic, or his work doesn't have that same energy, even if it is more, if the rendering is maybe more accurate.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I find that really fascinating. Like, how do you describe that? Like, hey, I mean, we talked about it in previous episodes on how, like, it helps you to understand people like Rob Liefeld. You know? Like,
sometimes style trumps...
Sometimes, yeah.
Pure technical correctness.
I've seen it happen, not just with Jack Kirby and Rob Liefeld. I've seen lots of technical artists, like people that are technically better than Rob Liefeld, try to prove how Rob Liefeld is by redrawing his pages, but like correctly. And yeah, the poses are all correct, the anatomy's correct, but they don't look as good as Rob Liefeld's
loses
pages.
That crazy punch.
Yeah.
There's something that's not there.
Like they look boring, you know, like and that's almost kind of what you're getting here, I think, you know, where it's like, and a lot of it might be more technically correct, but it just feels like off-brand Kirby.
Sure.
And it's hard to describe why Kirby is better than, even though you can look at it and be like, it's not technically correct, but I like it more. It's weird. I
want to make like music analogies here. Like maybe you have a really talented studio guitarist, but sometimes rambunctious, fuzzed out, broken guitar is more fun.
Yeah,
like
that's true. That's absolutely true.
It's a thing.
Yeah. So I don't know.
It's worth noting, like his art is still like. It's not like a night and day difference here.
No,
Alex Toth still does some very nice work. I kind of prefer Kirby, is all I'm saying.
I have to agree. I prefer Kirby too. As a Kirby fanboy, I love Kirby, and Alex Toth is a great artist, and I've actually I've seen a lot of his older art for his comics, and they look great. Like, he is a superior draftsman, like in almost every way. Like, the dude knows how to tell a story, and I think that's what's so weird about this. It's him working over Kirby's layouts. And I almost think that like that's what hinders him the most. I could see that. If he was working with like a full script and was like having to interpret a script rather than just draw over Jack Kirby's layouts, it would be a better issue. Or I mean, he would look better, if you know what I mean. Like it wouldn't feel like off-brand Kirby. It would feel like an Alex Toth comic.
Right. You know. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense to me.
Right.
I'll buy into that.
Yeah, and why not? Why not?
I get what you're selling.
Yeah. So the other weird thing...
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, so the other weird thing I wanted to bring up briefly was the whole subject of the design of the Juggernaut. And this kind of ties into the whole Alex Toth, Jack Kirby thing. I know I sent you that blog post. I first read about this in Brian Cronin's blog, Comics Legends Revealed, on the website that shall not be named anymore because it sucks. But just a little professional jab.
Ew.
But no, it's an interesting thing how the original design for Juggernaut was very different than what we see on the page here in this last panel. And the basic, it's sort of hard to piece together because, of course, all the people involved now are dead, or at least are old enough to be untrustworthy. But the original page, the page of original art, that this page exists, like the original art exists for this page, and just a little like shop talk here. I don't know how familiar you are with this, Alex, but the original pencils were done in blue line pencil.
Okay.
Which that's something that some artists do. They draw the page in blue pencil so that when it can be scanned and then inked over by the inker.
Right.
And
it's easy to get rid of the pencil lines then.
Exactly. Yeah, it's easier to clean up than like physically erasing it. So the original page of this, which was inked over, I believe that's the story. I'm not speaking necessarily definitively because I doubt myself. But the original page exists, and you can see the blue line pencil marks on the page for the original design of the Juggernaut. And maybe I'll put a picture of it. The picture exists. Maybe I'll put it up in the podcast. And
he's very different.
Very different.
He's got like spikes on him.
Yeah, and he's got a little Galactus toga belt.
Yeah, it's a very Kirby design.
And it looks terrible.
It's not something. It's kind of like the Vanisher, right?
Yeah.
Or not the Vanisher. The Vanisher.
Yeah, the Vanisher. Yeah.
Nobody really remembers that design.
Yeah.
Or it would have the same thing would have happened. It would have been this sort of generic villain design that didn't really stick in anyone's head. But what they ended up going with has become very iconic again.
Has been.
It's the Juggernaut look.
Going back to my thing about how Juggernaut's like one of my favorite villain, I think part of that also is because it's such a great look. I mean, the character looks great. He's just this huge, hulking guy, and he's got the big domed helmet and just like metal all over him. It kind of gets into that whole like less is more, like the simplicity of the design. I really love it. It's just like basically like some kind of Jack Kirby style version of like an Arbor Knight, right?
Sure,
you know?
Sure, okay.
And I think it looks great. And the other design was just so busy. Like there was just so much stuff going on with it.
Right. Yeah. There's a really nice simplicity to what it settled into.
Well, and I think
it's a little derpy in these. I mean, the groundwork is there.
Yeah. No, I get where you're going with this. Yes.
It got refined slightly over time in such a way that I think it really got even better.
Yeah.
And not to go jumping ahead, but also I really love having grown up in the 90s, Jim Lee's version of Juggernaut, or like the old Marvel vs. Capcom games in the 90s, yes. That Juggernaut where he's just like this, like, he's just a wrecking ball.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so good.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree that these issues, and I'm willing to write it off as just sort of like the kitschiness of these comics, this era of comics. But there is a thing where like Juggernaut kind of fluctuates in size. Like sometimes he's huge and sometimes he's kind of normal size looking. Like a normal man, you know, and yeah, which leads to kind of the derpiness of him. Like he's just kind of like sometimes he just looks like a little fat guy, you know, instead of like this huge hulking menace.
Right.
But as far as like the basics of the design, like you said, the groundwork is there, and I think that it works so much more for what the character is. This immovable, or not immovable, that's the Blob, the unstoppable force of the Juggernaut. He doesn't need all these extra things on him. Like he's like you said, he's a wrecking ball, which that's what this design is. It's just like a human wrecking ball. The domed helmet, you know, like it's.
Do you know, was that an Alex Toth decision?
I think the conclusion is actually that Alex I don't think you can say conclusively who did the first design.
Okay.
I think the idea is that maybe the first design was Alex Toth's design, because Kirby was actually not known to work in blue pencil. So these pages would have been penciled by Alex Toth over his layouts. So if the original design, this is the only thing we have to go off of, is that this page has blue pencil of the Juggernaut design, Alex Toth is probably the one who drew that. The question is whether or not he's drawing it based off of Kirby's designs or based off of just like a sentence description given to him by Stan Lee. I don't think you can say conclusively. I think you could maybe bet that maybe Alex Toth came up with that Juggernaut design and somebody somewhere didn't like it. And I do think that the Juggernaut design that we see in these comics, the final design, is by Jack Kirby, though.
Okay.
Interesting. So it was eventually redesigned, and I think Jack Kirby's the one who did it, from what I've read.
Okay.
Yeah.
Curious.
Yeah.
Some interesting comic book archaeology there.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
digging through the layers.
I like comic book history, and I like to sort of get into the the insider baseball, as it were, of comic creation.
Real story.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, let's see. Where are we at here? I'm just gonna Oh, have we really been talking for an hour? Holy crap.
Coming up on that.
All right. Well, let's.
I mean, the plot itself is very simple.
Yeah, yeah. There's not a lot. There's actually not a lot to talk about the plot.
I think it's more. I mean, I think where these issues shine is it's more the idea and the action and kind of the style over the ins and outs of the plot points. I mean, apart from that, you get flashbacks in issue 12 establishing the Professor X connection.
Yeah,
that's a big deal. But beyond that, it's a high stakes, action comic where they're desperately trying to come up with a solution as time is running out.
Right. So let's talk about a few things. I have a few topics I want to touch on. Number one, at the beginning of the podcast, I said that there were maybe a few things that bothered me about the plot necessarily. The first issue where Professor X is telling the origin, the origin of who his stepbrother is. I have to admit, there were a lot of times where I rolled my eyes, where I was like, why is Professor X telling them this story? It felt like there was no end goal.
Right.
He was like there were a few. I'm actually trying to find it. There were a few panels where it almost seemed like Professor X was like, we're doomed anyway, so I might as well tell you the whole story. And then there were panels where he was like, we got nothing else to do, so you might as well know. You know what I mean?
It's silly.
It's a little silly, yeah.
I appreciate the backstory, but they kept the Juggernaut's slowly making it through these levels of these defensive layers.
Yeah.
And each time he's slowed down, Professor X is like,
okay, now that
I'm glad we have a little bit of time because it lets me fill you in a little bit more.
Exactly. Now that we have this brief moment of reprieve,
right.
I'm not speaking literally, but that's what it felt like. He's like,
right.
We have this moment. You deserve to know what's about to kill you. That's the tone of it, where it's like Professor X has no plan. He's like, we're going to set up these defenses, and hopefully it'll stall him, but it probably won't, so I might as well tell you about what's coming. It's kind of weird. Well, and I mean, we've nitpicked some of the older issues, too, about how the plots don't work. So it confuses me, and this, I got to lay it at Kirby, because we've picked on Stan Lee a lot for not being the writer of these issues, and how Kirby's the one really writing it. It's almost weird that they don't just go with the whole Professor X is stalling for time so that he can build his stupid machine that'll amplify his powers. And in between there, in between doing that, he finds time to explain to them what's going to happen. You know what I mean? Like who this character is and why it's so important. But I guess because of the nature of what these comics are, and also the nature of it being a narrative and not necessarily like a story and not necessarily a realistic interpretation of events. The first issue is about getting the backstory, and it's about Professor X telling the backstory while the Menace is breaking through. I think it wouldn't have been too difficult to just clean that up a little bit in the writing of like there are too many panels where it looks like Professor X just doesn't know what he's going to do. Like there's no plans. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like
sure. Yeah. It's frustrating because it seems like it could have been easily fixed with minimal effort.
With minimal effort on Stan Lee's part.
Right.
Of just like this, it does seem like it was in the after the art has turned in phase. Stan Lee didn't really, and I mean I don't want to sound like I'm picking on Stan Lee too much. Maybe Jack Kirby didn't really add any notes about like what was going on. Maybe this is exactly how Kirby wanted it. It was good enough. You know what I mean? We get the backstory. They don't know how to stop him, and then he shows up, and then the next issue, Professor X comes up with the plan to stop him. You know, fair enough. But I mean, I got to be fair. Like I've been hard on previous issues for having sort of like weak internal consistency, weak internal motivations, and it does seem weird to me that this whole issue, Professor X has no plan for stopping Juggernaut. The first issue, anyway, like issue 12. There's no plan. Like the whole thing, he's like, someday he's gonna come, and when he does, I don't know if I can stop him. Oh, he's here. I might as well tell you about him before he kills us all. Like that's where Professor X is coming from. That's what it feels like to me, anyway.
It doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense from Professor X's angle.
Yeah, like why would he bother telling them?
Right. But from a let's create entertaining drama from that angle, this issue's really fun.
I agree.
Like it's not boring. It's like the Juggernaut keeps making it closer and he's in shadow.
Yeah.
Professor X is talking about how he's this like he's stronger than anything we faced and he's coming for us. And it just keeps getting closer, and he's in shadow, and he's huge, and there's explosions, and like it's kind of a horror movie setup. Yeah, it's really fun.
There's this like omnipresent sense of dread and doom throughout the whole issue.
Right.
And I agree. I like that. It just seems weird to me that
it doesn't make sense, like, from Professor X's vantage point.
Exactly, from Professor X's vantage point. It doesn't make sense why he's explaining things to the X-Men in the way that he's explaining to them. Like,
right.
You know?
Yeah. Is he trying to freak him out?
Right, like, why is he telling
Does he want him to give up?
Right, exactly, yeah. But like, yeah, like you said, from a drama standpoint, as, like, just, like, a reader, it is very exciting. We spoke about this earlier. Like, it doesn't let up. The momentum of this issue carries from page 1 to page 22, to the final page. Like, it's really fantastic. So, maybe what this all boils down to is, like, every complaint I've ever had is just a sham complaint. And really, all I care about is if you can entertain me. I don't care how logically internally consistent it is, as long as it's entertaining. And so every time I complain about a comic being logically inconsistent, really what I'm complaining about is it's just not fun. Maybe, I don't know.
Like if there's a
or maybe I'm just complaining about it not being satisfying.
You'll accept a certain amount of inconsistency provided the fun levels are high enough.
Well, I think that's actually true, and I think that's true for everybody. Even people that are hyper cynical or hypercritical. We all have a line, and we all have a suspension of disbelief, right? Like there's a level where we're like, for the sake of the entertainment, I'm willing to, understand that. And while I'm willing to complain about how weird Professor X comes across in this issue, and how I would get on my arrogant, sophisticated 21st century high horse and say I would do it differently if I were writing this issue. I would try to give Professor X a little bit more internal motivation and blah, 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 blah. That doesn't change the fact that it's a really, really great issue. Like, just in terms of just pure entertainment value, it's great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, the other thing I want to talk about, number B, is the flashbacks. We get this important scene where the scene I previously discussed in the description. We're still talking about issue 12 here. I think that's the issue we're mostly going to talk about in this topic, or I mean in this episode.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. But
we can note the whole story, but it seems like that's what we're focused right now.
The flashback where Professor X talks about this fateful day where he tries to make friends with Kane, and Kane's driving his car, and then they get into a car wreck.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of opens up into the greater discussion of the Marvel method itself, and what was Jack Kirby's intent with the art, and what was the story that Stan Lee wrote.
Sure.
And I'm going to put the idea out there, and this is something that I read about in this blog post by the Jack Kirby Museum. I mean, I might link to the actual blog post I read, where they talk about the difference in what feels intended in the art versus what's actually said in the story. And we see this scene where the car crashes, Kane jumps out of the car, Professor X is trapped in the car as it tumbles over a mountainside, and then I'm sorry, Alex, my cat just jumped on my lap. God damn it. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the car tumbles over the mountainside, and then the next page we get this really dramatic panel of Professor X like covering his face, you know, in his hands, like really sad. And I think if you didn't read any of the dialogue, if you just looked at the art, I think that the implication is really heavy that this is how Jack Kirby intended for Professor X to be paralyzed. That it was his stepbrother that paralyzed him in an attempt to murder him.
I mean, I could totally see that.
Yeah.
It contributes to the drama of this issue, and
it contributes to the theme of the character being named frickin' Kane Marco. Right.
Sure. And it feels very throwaway when I forget what the line was, but basically he says, "I was protected by my powers, though."
Yeah.
Like, wait. I mean, clearly that was written in by by
Stan Lee. Yeah.
Stan Lee.
Real after the fact.
Right.
That panel. Right. This is such a dramatic panel, and there's so much room for text. Like Jack Kirby drew it like in such a way, and the text is so weird. Like it's like an X-Men speaks off panel. I guess you could assume it's Cyclops maybe. But after Professor X tells the story of Kane getting into the car accident, which according to Professor X according to the way Stan Lee wrote it, it's an accident. Like like Kane Marco didn't see the danger sign, the detour sign, and had to jump out at the last second. But I think you could, just looking at the art, it looks like it was deliberate. It looks like he specifically tried to drive the car off a mountain and jumped out, knew what he was doing and jumped out of, trying to kill Professor X.
It does. It looks pretty clearly like that was what was happening.
It was attempted murder.
He's got the car door open, he's jumping out, and I mean it seems to imply that that's what happened.
Very intentional. But according to what Stan Lee wrote, it was a last minute accident. He didn't he actually wrote the dialogue bubble for Kane. I didn't see the detour. Jump. But it was too late. And so then we get that panel where Professor X is like really sad. This is supposed to be the most dramatic panel in the whole issue. Everything is leading up to this panel. This is why it's such a big deal for Professor X that all of this is happening. And the dialogue we get from an X-Men off-panel is them asking him, "Was that how you lost the use of your legs, Professor?" And then we get this beautiful little continuity moment where Professor X says, "No, that happened another time at the hands of the man you know as Lucifer, asterisk,
Right.
as mentioned in X-Men number 9, Stan."
Which was mentioned in number 9, but not drawn.
Exactly, and that's
Right.
an important thing to note, that it was never clearly indicated in the art in issue 9 that Lucifer had anything to do with Professor X's origin. We've complained about that issue quite a bit, about how that almost felt like just some random throwaway issue where it was Professor X on a side adventure investigating some bomb underneath Central European city.
Right.
And then Stan Lee just tried to jazz it up by making it really dramatic, and he just decided that this throwaway character, Lucifer, would be the one responsible for Professor X's paralysis. And I think you can infer, or it's not hard to understand, that Jack Kirby probably had no idea about that, because it's not like he was necessarily clued into what was happening to these issues after the fact, after he turned in the art. It wasn't intended for him to, he didn't write it that way. It wasn't the way he intended it. And even if Stan Lee told him, like, okay, this is how I wrote it, Lucifer is responsible for Professor X losing his legs, that's not out of the question that Jack Kirby would forget, because, you know, he didn't write it, and it wasn't in the art, and it was such a, like, throwaway line in that issue. And so you have this dramatic panel, which clearly is supposed to be Professor X admitting that his brother tried to kill him, and that's how he ended up being paralyzed. But instead, it's this weird editor's note where he's like, "No, that had nothing to do with my paralysis. That was some other adventure, which you all remember from several months back. But fortunately, my brain power saved me, but it still haunts me to this day." It's like so, like, oh man, like, what a ruined panel. Like, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining too much, because we liked these issues so much, but it bothers me to think of how much better it could be, you know?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it does seem like the words in the pictures weren't quite working together.
Yeah, it's a total mismatch. And I guess, to be fair to Stan Lee, is he wrote himself into a corner. We've talked about, like, we talk a lot about the Marvel method, and I think that this is ultimately the result, and possibly the downside of the Marvel method, is that you have a writer and an artist who are on two different pages, literally. And you have Kirby telling one story, and Stan Lee writing himself forcibly in a different direction.
Yeah. It's too bad. What are you going to do?
I mean, that's really what it comes down to. It's too bad, but what are you going to do?
What are you going to do? It was how they worked.
Yeah.
They still managed to create some stuff that shaped comics.
They did. And I guess that's important to point out, is despite that this, like, what I would say is clearly a botched moment, and certainly a missed opportunity, despite that, they still created, like, two comics that we're speaking very highly of and remember quite fondly. You know, so there's that.
Yeah. So our time's a little short.
Yeah,
but
we're coming up on the end here.
I felt like we should note that while Alex Toth did issue 12, issue 13 is done by Jay Gavin.
That's right.
Who I don't know Jay Gavin's work, but it seemed worth noting if we're going to talk about both of these. That though Jack Kirby did the layouts for 12 and 13, Alex Toth was just there for an issue, and then it was on to Jay Gavin, who I think also does a pretty solid job.
I think he does too. So we've mostly talked about issue 12, which is, I think, where most of the drama is. You know, it's all the build up to this action, which is why I like these two issues, is because, as we've discussed, there's a lot of tension and just a steady driving momentum through the story. So most of the drama is in the backstory, and then let's just, like, quickly kind of go over issue 13 here, which, as we said, Jay Gavin takes over as the penciler. And this is mostly just the action issue. Everything's been established, everything's been set up, we know the story, and it's a big fight. I mean, how did you like this issue compared to the previous issue, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, it wasn't as dramatic.
Right.
It didn't have the coming dread, scary, shadowy figure and doom around the corner feeling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But as mentioned before, I really appreciated that it's a nonstop fight broken up by Professor X kind of getting ready for his eventually facing Juggernaut.
Yes.
Where the X-Men are stalling Juggernaut, and I appreciate that it's a long fight and the X-Men are taking a beating.
Yes. Yes.
Like it's not just kind of like they almost got me, but I used my power to do this. Like,
right. I mean, Beast gets
Angel gets knocked out.
They all get knocked unconscious. Yeah, Beast and Angel both.
Beast is like crippled at one point.
Yeah,
like, he gets his leg crushed.
Yeah.
Like they're holding on, but they're losing.
Yeah.
And that creates its own drama. It's not the kind of horror movie drama of the previous issue, but it's still like, well, the intensity is still up.
It's not the like Scooby-Doo type of action that we've seen with Magneto, where they're like sort of using their powers. Yeah, exactly. Like you said, it's like actual confrontation. Like Juggernaut smashes Beast's leg, and I mean in the text it says it's like only a sprained ankle, but he can't walk. Like he's crawling across the floor to try and reach the the button to turn on the danger room. Like
again, the art and the words don't line up.
Yeah, exactly.
The art is really dramatic. On page 13, like Beast is like using his arms to pull himself across the room while Juggernaut is coming after him.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, you get that again on with Angel on page 17.
Yeah,
where Angel is like clawing his way out of unconsciousness because Professor X is calling him.
Yeah.
It's much more intense than the previous issues we've read.
Yeah. It does feel like it's such a level above every issue beforehand, except maybe the first issue. But I might actually be willing to say that it is still.
I think the action's better.
The action is better. Yeah.
I think the first issue just reads well as kind of a primer to the X-Men,
and as a single issue, yes.
Yes,
I would agree.
The threat of danger and the depiction of
the action
characters fighting, it's really good.
It's great. Yeah, it's unlike anything we've seen in any issue before, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I also like going with that. I like that they have a clever way of defeating the villain. Like it's not just like they can't defeat him physically. It relies on Professor X's mental ability. And it's, I mean, I don't know. Would you say it's a little bit of a MacGuffin? Like Juggernaut has a helmet that blocks Professor X's ability, so they figure out if we just get rid of the helmet, then Professor X can stop him.
I mean, I think it works because they find his weakness, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
And they pull in Johnny Storm, which I thought was a little silly, but
I thought the point is I thought that Johnny Storm was a little like filler, like
sure.
We need to fill out some pages with some other stuff here because we can't just have the X-Men stalling him for 20 pages before they mentally stop him, so we do these pages of Johnny Storm. Like literally there was like the first page where they contact him and Johnny Storm writes it off, and then they do another page. You know what I mean? It's like one attempt to contact him was enough to be like, okay, we're bringing her a guest star, but to like stretch it over a couple of pages where they have to try and convince him to show up, that to me feels like filler.
No, I think I agree with that, and I guess it's fun that at this point the Marvel Universe was still relatively small, and so you could have these cameos, and they were still pretty meaningful. So that's cool. But I think like in terms of Professor X's plan, the Human Torch is strong enough to use his fire to kind of slow the Juggernaut, and then he uses like the brightness of his firepower to blind the Juggernaut, which that's a clever move. Like you can't stop him, but if you can blind him, then you can use the other guys to get his helmet off.
Right.
So like ultimately, they come up with a good strategy and it works. There's no reason that they needed Johnny Storm to blind him, though, right?
That's what I was about to say. Yeah, like you could have had another X-Men fill that role, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You could have had somebody. You could have had a police officer with a flashbang. You could have had There's any number of things you could have done that would have been just fine.
You could have had Marvel Girl use her powers in some way to do something to blind him. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
But
so that's not really a criticism. It's just the use of Johnny Storm was more for the cameo fun than it was for actually being clever or required for the plot.
Absolutely. Which, as was proven by the fact that Professor X wipes his memory so that it never has to be referenced ever again. Johnny Storm doesn't even remember it happening.
I don't know what's wrong with a thanks, friend.
Right, exactly. Like, you'll always have a friend in the X-Men for that time you came to help us. Oh, never mind. We'll just wipe your memory. Now we don't owe you anything.
Still the morally questionable Professor X.
Right. I mean, you know, we've talked about this in previous episodes, but it is kind of incredible how often that comes up. Like, he's just ready to wipe people's memory left and right.
I used to be down on the whole need to make characters darker, but, like...
Right.
Seems like Professor X has been at it for a long time.
Yeah, seriously.
Well, I don't know if he's trustworthy.
Yeah, exactly. But I agree with everything that you're saying. I mean, the action is it's heavy. Like, it's so good. I like the way all the characters are utilized, and what I really like is that the way they're able to defeat the Juggernaut is by all of the characters working in conjunction through Professor X's commands. Like everything, like it's not like the most clever thing in the world, but I do like that there's this basically like a what would you call it? All of the characters' moves, like everything, it turns out, you know, has a purpose. Like it's not they're not just distracting him anymore. Like Beast is attacking. Like there's the scene of Beast attacking Juggernaut, and he's bouncing around and fighting him, and he can't. And then Beast tries to get his helmet off, and then he can't. And then Juggernaut beats him up, and then Angel's distracting him and flying around, and it's all the story. I like the way the story kind of culminates into this whole, like, they were all working under Professor X's direction to try and slowly chip away at the helmet, so that eventually, after he's been disoriented by Human Torch, Angel could swoop down at the perfect moment, right when the helmet was the weakest, and pull it off. I like that. I will say maybe it could have been done a little better, like a little more like purposefully, if that makes sense. Like it does. I don't know. I don't want to sound too critical of it, but it was well done. Well,
yeah, overall.
Yeah, overall.
I think it's a solid conclusion.
I agree.
The battle.
And I
think they had to.
Yeah, they had to work as a team. They had to, like, find the weakness, like you said.
Solve the puzzle.
Yeah, exactly.
How you got to get Juggernaut's helmet this time?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, good, and it pretty much set the precedent for Juggernaut stories. Like the helmet is his weakness. Like he's weak to mental powers. Otherwise, he's an unstoppable physical force.
Right.
I like it. It's a perfect setup for the two characters, Professor X and Juggernaut.
I like it as well.
Yeah. Well, I think we're reaching the end of our discussion here.
All right. It is a bit late.
Yeah, it's getting a little late. It's almost, I don't know if, like, I like that this episode has turned out because we've talked about more, like, had a more meta discussion or like an esoteric discussion about these issues rather than just describing what happened and why we did it.
Like that last issue.
Like that last issue was just terrible. This happened and it was stupid, and then this happened and that was also stupid.
No, yeah, we did that for a long time.
But it was so
we had a little
stupid.
more to talk about big picture with comics.
Big picture. That's the way to put it. Yeah.
Different art styles. And...
Right.
Yes.
So, we'll wrap up here a little bit. Across these two issues, could you pick out a favorite panel?
There's so many fight scenes that are cool.
So many,
but I mean, it's like
and you've already mentioned so many good ones of like Beast crawling across the floor, Juggernaut just kind of smashing through stuff. Like, it's all so good.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the shadowy Juggernaut.
Oh man, yeah, exactly. All those, the issue 12, all those panels of like Juggernaut like in the background while he's like tearing through stuff, and you never see a clear look at him. It looked fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound like I'm falling back onto form, but I love these panels of Cyclops trying to blast Juggernaut.
You just love Cyclops.
I do. I like it's a good visual, but I actually really like that sequence where Cyclops they momentarily kind of not distract him, but stall him by Cyclops just blasting a deep hole in the ground with his optic blast, and Juggernaut falls into it, and then Juggernaut has to climb out. And
yeah, that was it's
a good sequence, and I like that Juggernaut is clever enough to like start climbing out and then just dig a hole through the floor and blast up underneath them. That actual panel of Juggernaut bursting through the floor underneath Cyclops it's like great. You know?
Yeah.
And that's not even a panel of Cyclops using his power, which I like those panels, but like,
sure,
that's a cool panel.
That whole page is fun.
It's
like,
a great page, yeah.
The way you get this kind of funny, like, sectional view of
of the Earth,
like this Dig Dug kind of view of Juggernaut,
exactly. Like, Dig Dug
moving like sideways through the Earth under the characters. It's fun.
Yeah,
I like it.
It is. But like that. Like the panels of Juggernaut bearing down on Cyclops with Cyclops on the floor, like trying to blast Juggernaut, you know?
Yeah.
They would be better if the perspective was a little better, like the scale looks a little off. Like Juggernaut looks a little too small in that panel, and Angel's kind of
changes a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, but I mean, it's a great idea for a scene. Like it's. You know, it's a good moment for the scene, but yeah, I do enjoy those. In in issue 13, in issue 12, there are a lot of great panels. Honestly, all the Juggernaut stuff is great. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I could pick out like a single good panel.
I think I agree. I think that it's so action heavy. You get a lot of similar stuff, but it's all pretty interesting.
Yeah. It keeps you into it the whole way.
No souls being blasted into the universe.
That's true. Yeah, there's no like standout panel, but I mean, maybe that's a testament to how good it is. Like, we're not bored until that one interesting looking panel. Like, it's all pretty.
Right. No, the whole thing is moving.
Yeah, it's exactly
moving.
It's all moving. It's good. I like that. I appreciate that.
It's good comics.
Yeah, it's fun. I wish all the X-Men comics were like this.
I agree.
I mean, am I right or am I right? There was only one thing we sort of forgot to talk about, and I'm only going to mention it so that maybe we can talk about it in the future. What do you think about the Crimson Gem of Sidorak and Professor X just knowing what it is? It's a little glossed over.
It's a little shoehorned in there.
Yeah. Like, it's just oh.
It's, I mean, like, big picture, it's kind of silly.
Yeah.
It's kind of stupid. But, my brother was a brute who was jealous of me because I overcame him as a child with my intelligence and my secret abilities. But then finally he stumbled upon power, and there's going to be a reckoning. Like,
well, actually,
I guess I like this setup. It just was kind of.
I actually love the setup in that sense.
Yeah.
I like the conflict of And
Yes.
it's sort of touched on in these issues actually about how like Professor X when he challenges when they come to head at the end, and Professor X kind of boasts like he's like, I can defeat you with my powers because my powers are a part of me. That's who I am. You just have this unearned power, and I think that that's an important aspect of the character. There's a purity to Professor X being a mutant. It's who he is. It's pure. Whereas, Kane as the Juggernaut is actually like a not just impure, but more of a gosh darn it, I can't think of the word. Like it's on the tip of my tongue. Like a monstrous. Help me out here, Alex. You got anything you're thinking of?
I'm not quite sure.
Like Kane is ooh, this is bothering me so much.
He's dishonest. He steals. He takes what isn't his.
He's a corruption. Kane is like a corrupted person.
Sure. Okay.
Because by his power has come through like an evil outside source. It's not a part of him. So he's a bad person already. He's a corrupted person. But then the power he gets corrupts him even further. Whereas Professor X, it's all internal and it's all something that he has learned through discipline of who he is. And I think that that's like important, kind of like what you were saying, like big picture, like the meta story, or if you'll allow me to go in this direction, the archetypes which these characters fill.
Sure.
I think that that's perfect for who the characters are. Professor X is pure and honest discipline, and the Juggernaut is a corruption of greed and bitterness. And it's reflected in their powers and in how they use their powers. So I love that.
I'm good with that.
Yeah.
If I want to play the dangerous game of, but if I wrote it today.
Exactly, yeah. I just wish we didn't have to have a panel of Professor X saying, it's the sacred lost temple of Sidorak. Don't touch the gem. You know what I mean? Like,
right. Like, what?
Why does Professor X know what it is? Where did it come? You know what I mean? Like, it's just all...
It would have been less... It's glaring, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's this thing that doesn't fit with the rest of the story. And it's not... That's not unforgivable. It's fine. It's a 60s comic, and it adds some crazy, funky fun to it.
Yeah.
But part of me is like, well, why didn't he just, like, steal a serum from the military? Or,
exactly.
From his father's lab. Or there are a lot of other ways you could have had him gain powers through unsavory means.
Yeah.
Why you needed to introduce this, like, 2-panel, it's the Black Magic Temple.
Exactly. It's the evil space alien magic temple.
Right.
Like, why? How does that work?
Where did that come from?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It would make more sense to use more modern X-Men mythology if it was like a scientific attempt to jumpstart his latent mutant abilities that never manifested. And by doing so, they're unnatural and unearned, and so he never had a chance to grow with them and come to terms with them, so they completely corrupt him. Bam.
Sure.
Like that's how you make it fit within the main themes of mutants versus humans, instead of just being this like weird alien magic. Like, it's not. Right. I'm saying alien, but it's not actually like. There's no implication of what it is. It's just some mystical gem,
There's something about black magic, yeah. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
It's out of left field.
Right. It is out of left field, and I think you can make it work for the reasons that I said. I think you can make it work in the sense of it being an outside source, which makes it a corruption. It adds to that aspect of it, but it is a little kitschy,
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's all we can say about these two issues.
All right.
So we'll end with, I got to ask you, Alex.
Bring it.
How many Juggernaut helmets out of 5 would you give these two issues in conjunction? I was going to ask you to rate them individually, but let's just say in conjunction, these two issues.
Yeah, it reads as,
Yeah.
for simplicity, it's one story.
Yeah, exactly.
What did we give issue 1?
We gave issue 1 4.5. We talked about this. I mistakenly...
I'd probably give it 4.
A solid 4?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good with that. A solid 4, which is...
I think it's more fun than issue 1 in some respects, but, like, I don't know, in terms of it, like...
I think there's more invested in these issues than issue 1, but I kind of agree with you. Like, issue 1 just reads so easily, and it sets everything up really well. Like, it's actually a really good first issue. Like, I actually think it's an incredible first issue. More so than maybe other series first issues.
Yeah. It's really strong.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, 4 Juggernaut helmets out of 5. Easily.
All right.
Yeah, easily.
I can live with that.
Yeah, me too. Okay, right. So we're going to call that episode at this point. Thanks, everybody, for listening. My name is Aaron Walther. You can find comics that I write at GoComics.com. You can find my new comic updated every Monday and Thursday called American Chop Suey. Again, that is at GoComics.com. And you can find my other comic that I write called The Uncontrollable Reclass. That's at Tapastic. Go to Tapastic.com and you can look for The Uncontrollable Reclass. And you can find MP3s of this very podcast at comicdna.podbean.com. And we are also on YouTube, YouTube channel Comic DNA. I think that does it for this episode. I had much more fun talking about these issues than I did the last several issues, Alex. So
agreed. It's fun talking about things that are good.
Yeah, exactly. So the next episode we do, I haven't decided how we're gonna deal with this whole X edition numbering mess. But I think the next episode we're actually gonna cover 3 issues. Issue 13, 14, and 15. So that's just going to throw an even bigger wrench into the whole problem. But we'll burn that bridge when we come to it. But hopefully we'll get to that soon. Yeah. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you next time.